Matt, you're not a dumb guy. You're a very, very smart guy. You know the history of the CIA overthrowing democratically elected governments. The list is the longest of any country in the 20th century. So that being said,
I think the CIA actually gets too much credit for successfully overthrowing governments.
All the CIA apologists do, man. They always think it doesn't really do a whole lot. It's crazy.
Holy cow, didn't see you there, folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Homeless Romantic Podcast. I'm Chris Jeffries. Who else we got here today? Mike?
Mike from the Turn Left Podcast and Instagram meme page.
And I'm Matt, also known as American Gopnik. I, at one point in my life, was an open source intelligence analyst and sort of conflict journalist. And for the last 2 years or so, I've been in Ukraine as a combat medic.
Combat medic. So what brought you there? I mean, you obviously got a pretty thick American accent. Where'd you come from and how did you end up in Ukraine?
Well, before this conflict, I actually got interested more in international conflict and geopolitics during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And that's where I started getting really into open source intelligence and conflict journalism. And I did some work on that. And after about a year, I was less involved in that world. And then I noticed about maybe a month before the actual full-scale invasion that a lot of the Telegram channels that I followed, where I was sourcing information about the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, had started, like, from inside Russia, there was a lot of movement of military hardware to the Ukrainian border, like huge amounts. So I got back involved again. And
what year was that? And what was the name of the conflict? You said something, what was it called?
The 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And there's still tension there today, right?
Yes, it's really unfortunate, but essentially it looks like Armenia is ceding more territory, even inside its own internationally recognized borders, to Azerbaijan, and more people are being forced to flee their homes. And it's basically the end stage of a successful ethnic cleansing campaign that saw last year over 100,000 Armenians displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah. And the Armenians are kind of like the Palestinians of that region. They've always been genocided and hated and, displaced. So let's go back to the Ukraine thing. The contention that we came to have this little debate or this conversation was that you wanted me to desperately pick a side, right? You want me to decry Russia and stand for Ukraine. I respect Ukrainian borders and everything, but I think it's disingenuous to say that this conflict was one-sided. And so I just wanted to get your opinion on how this conflict in Ukraine started, going as far back as you can possibly go historically.
Well, I could go back very far historically. For example, if you study the history of the Russian Empire, Ukraine has a very long history over the last 400 years of being treated incredibly poorly, where going back to like the 19th century, where basically land was being given to German Mennonites who used the serfs, treated the serfs there very badly, which they were basically slaves. They were tied to the land. They were not allowed to move. And then, but let's not go into that like Russian Empire history, but breakup of the Russian Empire, which is really when the concept of Ukrainian national identity starts. Ukraine actually played a very important part in the Russian Civil War. Specifically, Nestor Makhno and the Black Army assisted the Red Army fighting the White Army. And during this process, Ukraine was actually promised independence. And the moment the Russian Civil War ended, Lenin and Trotsky basically pulled the rug out from under Makhno and forcefully integrated Ukraine into the Soviet Union. And as part of that, that was also when they really pushed the Russification angle. Specifically, under the Soviet Union, they made this decision to standardize the Ukrainian language. And a big part of that was they actually stripped out large portions of the language that were either not easily pronounced by Russian speakers or grammar that was not easily understood by them. So already going back to the beginning of the Soviet Union, there is a very, very clear example of how the Russian-led Soviet Union was attempting to essentially damage Ukraine's culture. So you can, within the context of modern history, there's already a separate cultural identity and a very clear attempt from Russia to destroy that. And
now,
you can just go through the rest of the Soviet Union, and that story is repeated over and over again.
Can I ask, like, why we would just, when we're talking about modern history, we're looking at the Soviet Union, which ended in 1990 or whatever, and not the other 30 years since then or 40 years since then? It's like, it doesn't seem to make much sense to me. Like, I would talk more about NATO expansion than the Soviet
I agree
Union.
with that, but not necessarily on the NATO angle. I would argue that in 1991, Ukraine was internationally recognized as an independent country. Russia recognized Ukraine as an independent country and recognized Ukraine's borders and sovereignty. Ukraine got a seat at the United Nations. And from that point onwards, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It can do what it wants. Beyond that, in 1994, under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine was actually heavily pressured, not by Russia, but by the United States and other Western countries to fork over its entire nuclear arsenal. At this point, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. As part of them doing this, they didn't just give up nukes. They also gave up their entire long-range strategic bombing fleet, as well as most of their intermediate and short-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. So some of those missiles actually ended up getting launched back at Ukraine during this war, specifically some cruise missiles.
So obviously this is true. Look, when in 1970, the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists kind of absorbed all the other countries and made a huge country out of it. The Ukrainians didn't want it. Flash forward to when 1991, Ukraine had a referendum where 92% of the Ukrainians voted in favor of independence from the Soviet Union. Nobody's, doubting the fact that Ukrainians have a specific culture and that is separate from Russia. I think what the contention here is that American influence in, let's be honest here, NATO is a Trojan horse of Western and American power, that this old CIA way of doing things, going in there and subverting elections and putting money towards opposition candidates, is kind of what it smells like in Ukraine. And I think there's lots and lots of evidence to suggest that Ukraine maybe could have kept its independence had they not pushed for NATO expansion, for not, wanting to be Western.
Well,
in that sense.
Here's my concern. Before Maidan, Ukraine actually tried to join NATO of its own free will, and NATO resoundingly told them that they were not welcome. It was made very clear that there was no interest within NATO of adding Ukraine to the alliance. Beyond that, there is the reality that NATO is, legally speaking, purely a defensive alliance, and while sometimes...
Now that's funny.
Yeah,
it is. NATO has been.
I mean, legally speaking, sure. But,
yeah, legally speaking. But beyond that, no one has ever been pressured to join NATO. In fact, joining NATO is fairly difficult because you need every other country in NATO to agree to it, to the point where Finland and Sweden trying to join was actually a long and protracted process because there were multiple countries in NATO that were unfriendly to them for various political reasons. But even getting beyond that, the reality is that pre-2014, NATO membership was not on the table for Ukraine. It just was not. Post-2014, it was also off the table because no country that's currently involved in any sort of conflict or border dispute can actually join NATO. So at no point since the breakup of the Soviet Union has Ukraine ever been considered a serious contender for NATO membership until February of 2022 when Russia invaded. And even then, there are NATO, including the United States, NATO members that don't support Ukraine joining at any point in the near future. So I don't really buy that argument.
But it also goes back to, there was not a written agreement, but there was a oral agreement that said NATO would not expand beyond the Soviet bloc countries. And that was upheld until the fall of the Soviet Union. And as soon as the Soviet Union fell, America felt like they had all the right to expand NATO into Poland. And then they started moving their way, east. And that's what I say. And I want to push back on what you said about NATO being a defensive. The 1999 Kosovo War in Yugoslavia, NATO bombed the Chinese embassy, killing 3 journalists. The war in Afghanistan after 9/11, NATO participated in combat operations against the Taliban. And in Iraq, NATO was also involved, despite lack of a UN mandate. So,
I mean, each one of those is a massive kettle of worms. But once again, in several different instances, while there were multiple members of NATO present, there were also members of non-NATO nations present too. For example, in the Yugoslavian Civil War, I believe Sweden participated, and Sweden only joined NATO last year. So there's that element. Also, the Chinese embassy bombing gets into some really weird specific stuff that's actually, I don't have any proof of this, but there's, based on research, you're aware of the shooting down of an F-117 Nighthawk fighter, right? The first stealth aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Well, apparently, as the rumors have it, pieces of that stealth aircraft were basically sold to the Chinese, and they were being stored in the Chinese embassy. And
well, as the great Christopher Hitchens said, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Yeah.
So rumors are rumors.
What we do know is the Chinese absolutely did get their hands on pieces of it because that directly tied into the development of their current generation stealth aircraft.
Wow. Well, good for them. They want to build their own military. They've been. Yeah. I mean, China had been through 100 years of what they called the 100 years of humiliation, where we turned them on to opium and bombed their country. And the Pentagon Papers said the whole reason that we went into Vietnam was to contain China. So,
oh no, you're not going to see me defending the Vietnam War. I'm not going to justify everything NATO's done. I'll defend the operation in Yugoslavia because, let's be honest here, the Serbs are incredibly unapologetic about the ethnic cleansing they engaged in, to the point where they have folk songs titled "My Father is a War Criminal," and I believe Slobodan Milosevic basically said, "I regret nothing, they deserved it," and then committed suicide in prison, to the best of my knowledge with science.
Most people bold enough to commit genocide don't really just change their mind after the fact. They're pretty... Yeah, it's hard to denazify Germany. It just never really took. It was always underneath the surface.
Yeah, but
it's not a Western.
Going back to it, I believe the intervention in Yugoslavia was justified. And but either way, getting back on the topic of NATO expansion, first of all, the conversation with Gorbachev, where supposedly someone promised not to expand NATO into the Warsaw Pact countries, is apparently apocryphal. There's actually an interview with Gorbachev himself where he says that conversation never happened. Beyond that, consider all the countries that did join NATO and what kind of history they had with Russia. Poland.
Chris, do you want to pull up that link that I just sent in the chat, which is the William Burns memo I was talking about before?
Oh, yeah.
I can read it if you want, but I don't know if you can stream it.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. You get some FaceTime in here.
No problem. So let's see. So this is the Niet means Niet memo that William Burns, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, who later became director of the CIA. This is in 2008, and he said, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement, and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the... Sorry, this is really small. I just got to make it a little bigger if I can. With much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. And then when you have the situation that we're talking about in 2014, from the same article that I'm reading from one of my favorite sources, which is Ben Norton, he says, in response to the 2014 putsch, Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern Donbass region rose up against the coup government in Kyiv, which they denounced as an illegitimate Western puppet regime. Independence activists declared the creation of two new autonomous states, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Ukrainian government, with Western military support and weapons, has waged a brutal war against these breakaway republics in the Donbass ever since. Thousands of Ukrainians have been killed and hundreds of thousands of more have been displaced. Ukraine, which shares a massive 2,300-kilometer border with Russia, has been rocked by violence and instability since the 2014 US-backed coup. And this constant turmoil has had significant effects inside Russia, especially economically. This was precisely the civil war scenario that Burns had warned about in 2008. On February 21st, 2022, Russia officially recognized Donetsk and Lugansk as independent states. Then, on February 24th, Moscow launched an invasion of Ukraine, which it said aimed to, quote, demilitarize and, quote, denazify the country. Russia's goal is to force Ukraine to maintain political neutrality, preventing it from being a Western military outpost that could threaten Russia on its borders, potentially with nuclear weapons. And I think at this point, I would even say it was probably a bad idea, all in all, for Russia to have launched the special military operation or the invasion, whichever you like to call it, in hindsight. But I think at this point, now that we're living in that world where it has happened, the best thing would be to negotiate for peace sooner rather than later, because of the nature of how these things can escalate and how much that is not in the interest of anyone who wants there to not be a nuclear war.
And I'll pass that to Matt, and I'll ask Matt, why aren't we coming to the negotiating table then?
So I want to push back on some of the contents of that article because there is a lot of opinion and conjecture that is in no way established fact. Specifically, the coup in Ukraine, or if you could even properly describe it as a coup, was specifically caused by Western interference. And the reason I'm saying this is it's necessary to have political context for Ukraine in 2014, before this happened, and 2013.
I think we might have to find that Victoria Nuland clip where she says Yats is our guy. She's talking on the phone and admits that they are doing the coup in favor of Yats. Like,
the Ukrainians always dismiss the Nuland thing. They go, oh, yeah, no, that doesn't count.
There can be multiple moving pieces, but the reality is Yanukovych was elected on a pro-EU platform. At the time, and going forward, the idea of Ukraine joining the EU economic zone was incredibly popular. Ukraine was economically suffering in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis that messed up the United States and Europe, and being able to basically export large amounts of their grain and the like to Europe without having to be heavily taxed would be a massive economic boon for the country. This was something that was universally popular. Join the EU economic zone. And Yanukovych, when he was running for office, said he supported it. He would do it. And then at the absolute last minute, he pulls out and says they're joining some sort of Russian-led economic project instead for some loan or something. I don't remember the details off the top of my head. But people were really, really mad. And it was really obvious that he was not making this decision in Ukraine's best interest. He was making this decision in Russia's best interest. And then this triggered protests, and Yanukovych reacted to these protests extremely brutally. Ukraine had only just become essentially a more free and open society in 23 years before this. So lots of people in Ukraine remembered what it was like to have the KGB around, to live in the Soviet Union, and people didn't want to go back to that. It was a really unpopular decision with Ukraine's parliament. Ukraine's parliament massively voted to remove Yanukovych as president. And when Yanukovych ended up fleeing the country, he stole millions and millions of dollars worth of Ukrainian art and probably even just straight up gold when he fled directly to Russia, where he proceeded to purchase a $50 million mansion in the Ural Mountains in cash.
That's true. That's true.
The dude was absolutely incredibly close with Russia. He had an exit plan set up to go to Russia. He stole an incredible amount from Ukraine in the process of going to Russia. So I can't really see an argument here that this was a Western-backed coup against a Ukrainian that had good interests for Ukraine in mind, when every single action he took in response to what was initially relatively mild protests and then his process of fleeing the country just screamed Russian plant.
Sure.
It
And
just kind of sounds to me
no,
like he was a victim of the West and then did what they all do, which is like get screwed. But he survived it as opposed to some of the others.
So how is he a victim of the West for reneging on his own campaign promises at the absolute last second in an incredibly unpopular way and then sending snipers to shoot protesters?
Yeah, no,
I mean, I don't know that
Yanukovych.
he sent the snipers. Like,
Yeah, Yanukovych was just like any leader of a small country in a multipolar imperialist world. He had two options. He could be Western, he could be Russian. He took forever to decide. He thought maybe he'd go over here. He ended up going over here. At the end of the day, now he's just a pariah. Is he dead yet? Or I don't know.
He's living it up in his very expensive mansion in Russia to this day. I mean, look, ultimately, Ukraine is a democracy. Like most democracies, it is a flawed democracy. It absolutely has problems, like most states that were part of the Soviet Union do, because unfortunately, living under that Soviet system just left incredible psychic scars on everyone involved. But the reality is,
tended to do that to Nazis mostly.
Yeah.
I mean, he did something incredibly unpopular, and
they kind of
the people that elected him didn't want him anymore. That's like
my contention is also that, look, Ukraine wanting to be more aligned with Europe or more aligned with America, which is a capitalist system that inherently always breaks out in some kind of fascist fervor every so often, every few decades or whatever, and is prone to crashes. You know, you have the United States who has no health care, while Russia is pulling people out of poverty the last 2 decades. Their GDP is increasing. Their standard of living is increasing. They have preventative health care and universal health care measures for everybody. So I'm just wondering, multipolar.
You're referring to the writings of Alexander Dugin when you say multipolar, specifically the man who wrote On Geopolitics and is one of Vladimir Putin's preferred political philosophers.
I can say multipolar, and I could be addressing anybody. It doesn't, just because if Putin says the sky is blue, and I agree with him, I'm not spreading Russian disinformation. I'm just talking.
Yeah, I'm very curious, Matt. Like, what are your politics? Like, where would you say you align politically? Like,
liberal or?
I honestly have no idea. I have a very, I have a collection of views that are, I believe, uniquely my own. And
you seem pretty staunchly against communism in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So we can at least point that out.
I am.
Why? Why?
Because it was a system that created an immense amount of bureaucracy, ultimately treated most people very poorly, crushed dissent, crushed in a lot of ways.
Crushing dissent is just something that happens in every single country, no matter what.
I'm curious, as a medic over there in Ukraine, like how many fascist tattoos are you seeing on these soldiers over there?
Yeah, how many swastikas do you see over there?
I've seen a number, but I've also seen plenty on Russian soldiers. There's actually a great video that I posted. There's a video I posted on my Instagram from early in the war that is of a person from a DPR militia being awarded a medal for killing over 200 Ukrainian Nazis. And my favorite part is clear as daylight on the man's shoulder, right there in HD on the video, you can see a Totenkopf patch. This war was never about
white supremacy can take any form. Like it.
No, I think that like this all just. I'm not saying like Ukraine is specifically like a Nazi country. I just think they have a suspicious amount of fascists in the military and in their like militias that are officially incorporated into their government now in a way that like even the Wagner group that everyone is so scared of is not incorporated into the Russian government in any like official way and doesn't have any kind of like concentration of Nazis in like. But also, I think what is going to be proven over the next few decades is that Ukraine was unfortunately used as a proxy to have a war with Russia between the United States that, you know, they can't do directly because it would be unpopular or it would just be too escalatory and too like consequential for all of humanity to risk that kind of a war. So they do it through a proxy, just like they do with every other like Western European country.
Two things. First of all, your information is out of date. Wagner has been fully integrated into the Russian government, and it was created by the Russian government to begin with. I'm sorry,
after they got rid of what's his name, the plane crash guy.
After Prigozhin, but let's be realistic here. There is no private military company that is truly independent of a government that also operates multiple Su-34 fighter bombers and is also set up by a guy.
By that logic, you would say that the United States tried to overthrow the government of Venezuela. It was military contractors, but essentially you're saying that the United States did it then.
So with Silver Corp, honestly, my personal theory is that was some just very stupid people that thought they could impress Trump by trying something that was doomed from go. That was never going anywhere. And I doubt that had state backing, just because as inept as the U.S. government
But by your logic,
can be,
where were they based? They were based in the United States.
There's a little bit of a difference between being like 15 guys that like train in a country that have firearms that anyone with the proper licensing paper can procure, and people operating fourth generation fighter jets that cost $75 million a piece. Especially since the Su-34 has not been sold to a country that isn't.
All right. Well, here's a quiz for you. How many people in the Wagner Group?
I have no idea right now. The last time I was thinking heavily about Wagner was when I was deployed to Bakhmut.
And how many people in Silver Corp?
I'd be shocked if there's.
Does Silver Corp
even still exist?
I mean, I'm sure that they.
Is this like one of the Ukrainian Nazi militias? Sorry.
No, Silver Corp was the U.S. Venezuelan one that, I would be shocked if there's more than 20 people in Silver Corp. Wagner has, at least at its peak, probably had thousands of people. Obviously, I know there's a difference in resources, but if you dig into the people that set up Wagner, specifically Yevgeny Prigozhin's longstanding personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, as well as Dmitry Utkin, who was high up in the FSB before he ended up involved in running Wagner. Oh, speaking of Nazis, Dmitry Utkin is a great guy to pull up a picture of because he has SS bolts and SS rank tattoos.
That's crazy.
All capitalist countries, Russian or American, are going to have people who have issues with white supremacy, any kind of supremacy, really. But capitalism breeds these kind of people, hierarchies. They want rigid hierarchies, and they want minorities dead or whatever. Just like
your defense of all the Ukrainian Nazi soldiers so far has been when Americans are like, yeah, bro, but how much better do you think it would be if you started like taking the clothes off American cops or soldiers? I'm like, that is not a good defense at all. Like, that's really fucking bad, dude. Like, but like, what bugs me about this whole thing is like the people who are like anarchists or liberals who claim to have even been leftists up to this point now all of a sudden start like ignoring all these fucking Ukrainian fascists and claiming and like making all these excuses about these supposed Russian fascists. And like, no one is showing me anywhere near the amount of evidence that there are all these like Russian Nazis or in like all these different militias or even in Wagner as like in any kind of concentration as there are in all these different militias. Like, Chris, I'm getting the impression that you have some kind of search engine that you're using where you're Googling the numbers of these different militias. Cause like, it's one thing to talk about like,
I just wanted to throw out another Russian militia. If you want to find some like hardcore white nationalist stuff organized at the unit level, look up Rusich Battalion.
Okay, cool. But while you're at that, look up also Right Sector, IDAR, what is it? UDA, OUN.
So here's the thing, boys. Yeah. At the end of the day, it's the same thing. Look, Russia is using private security firms. America's using private security firms. It allows them to clean their hands of any kind of real responsibility for war crimes. At the same time, lets them do. So there's no argument here. There's no argument.
I think we're getting way too into the weeds on the Nazi thing. And I will also
have too many militias that I can list is the problem.
Yeah, and
I have a whole lot of Ukrainian Nazi militias. And that's like, that's the whole thing, man. Like, you don't have to take like even a neutral stance. You can just be anti-fascist and you can recognize this is just like all the previous conflicts that the West has waged, supposedly in the name of national sovereignty or coming as liberators, when they've actually been trying to expand their own powers or really it's an economic thing. They want to wage like privatization and they want to take control of all these resources that the Ukrainian government still controls a lot of.
That's great.
Matt, you're not a dumb guy. You're a very, very smart guy. You know the history of the CIA overthrowing democratically elected governments. The list is the longest of any country in the 20th century. So that being said,
I think the CIA actually gets too much credit for successfully overthrowing governments.
All the CIA apologists do, man. They always didn't. They always think it doesn't really do a whole lot. It's crazy. Just like the US military with all the 900 bases, like it's not the expansionist one. It's just kind of defensive. It's like it's not the empire.
It's not. You are literally.
So when I say that the CIA hasn't successfully overthrown governments, I'm not saying that the United States hasn't successfully overthrown governments. What I'm talking about is here's the cornerstone of any discussion on this: Guatemala, right?
That's the basics.
Successfully, though, because
United
I think
Fruit
it's a
Company,
success
sure.
to simply destabilize a government.
Well,
that's profitable for the U.S. and its military contractors. They're happy to just destabilize
it was successful, and the CIA did not succeed there. The CIA tried multiple ways to start a revolution in terms of arming people, starting like discontent.
Why did they have to go that far back to Guatemala, though? And you skip all the other ones that, like in the Wikipedia page, that are too long to list. Like,
and the thing is, saying Guatemala didn't last that long is totally wrong. Like,
can you please let me finish, because I haven't gotten to my point here.
Go ahead.
The reason I'm bringing up Guatemala is one of the big ones that gets invoked by people as an example of a CIA regime change. And internally, I'm sure that the CIA also talks about Guatemala as one of their own success stories. But the reality was that most of the CIA quiet under the table plotting to create some sort of organic revolution miserably failed. They actually, among other things, failed to even smuggle guns to people there because they got caught by U.S. Customs before they took them out of the country. Instead, what actually happened was that eventually the United States is putting pressure on the Guatemalan government for enacting too many socialist policies, led to a senior military leader just rising up and taking over in the process. But it was not the sort of color revolution that people like to describe as the hallmark of a CIA coup, where they subtly insert actors and create protests and then use that to create some sort of flashpoint that boils over into a pro-U.S. revolution.
Matt, are you familiar with what happened in Chile in 1973?
Oh boy, that's a very, very grim one. Yes, I am familiar with that.
Go ahead and describe what happened.
The CIA backed Augusto Pinochet in his coup, which was partially triggered due to basically sanctions on Chilean copper that severely messed up the economy. And then they also provided Pinochet with torture equipment and that sort of thing. That's where the whole free helicopter rides thing comes from.
And how long was he in there? I know that you're saying that the CIA only did things for short amounts of time. How long did Pinochet, was he in power?
Pinochet was in power, I believe, for something like 25, 26 years.
Okay, so 17 years, until 1990. Yeah. So not exactly a short amount of time, enough to torture people and oppress people for a generation or two.
Once again, though, there's a difference between starting a color revolution, which is not a real thing, and simply convincing someone that is already high up in a country's military.
Wait, can you expand on that?
Oh, yeah, sure. Can you define a color revolution for me?
Well,
that would be like some
colorful.
kind of movement that's fomented by a foreign government that pretends to be like a grassroots one.
You're just going with that. So then, by that logic, almost every revolution is a color revolution. You could argue the American Revolution was a color revolution. A
color revolution refers to a series of nonviolent protests and political movements that aim to overthrow authoritarian regimes and establish Western-style liberal democracies in several post-Soviet states and the former Yugoslavia in the early 21st century.
Oh, then I guess Ukraine doesn't meet that definition either.
This is a semantic argument. Yeah, it's whether or not our people are oppressed, is Western powers going in there and meddling in. It's all semantic. Did they do something wrong? Was it unethical? Was it immoral for us sticking our nose into other people's business abroad? Yes. Did we do it more than any other country on earth? Yes.
But
Matt, can I ask you, like, real quick? You seem to be you're much better at history than I am, admittedly. And you were talking before about Ukraine getting its independence from the Soviet Union. Did Stepan Bandera have anything to do with that? Was he involved in that at all?
Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian partisan during World War II.
Yeah, I don't know enough. Like I said, I don't know enough about him.
Yeah,
I just know that he's like a national hero there, which is problematic.
Is that the air raid siren, Matt?
Yes, that is the air raid siren. I live in Odessa, and this goes off several times a day. Let me check Telegram to see if you're about to hear some kabooms.
And again, we're not saying that we care for the safety of you. We care for the safety of Ukrainian people. The bombing of civilians, totally terrible. Russia invading, unacceptable. Putin's in a quagmire. It's never going to end. We understand that. We're with you. I'm an empathetic person. I'm a vegan. I'm for the animals, for the people, blah, 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 blah. But I just want to be sure that it takes two to tango in these kind of affairs. And me and Mike know for sure is that capitalism and America are some of the most destructive things that is currently facing humanity. And the biggest threat to world peace.
I actually disagree with that. And here's my issue. The crimes of America are very publicly known. And the reason for that is that America, as many problems it has, and don't get me wrong, I have a lot of problems with the US government, and I have a lot of things that I can complain about. But America, relative to most other countries on earth, has fairly free access to information and relatively free speech. The Freedom of Information Act means that the dirty secrets that a lot of other countries have that stay buried for much longer do become public. And in America, we have the freedom to talk about the bad things our government does.
Why is Julian Assange in trouble? Why is Snowden in trouble? Why is Reality Winner in trouble?
Well, here's the issue.
Why is John Kiriakou not being pardoned? I just talked to John Kiriakou.
You're perfectly allowed to have discourse. You're just not allowed to actually change it. Like, this is my whole point, is like, everyone who is an apologist for Ukraine in this situation is always an apologist for American hegemony. And they always look at multipolarity just as a bad thing, but just inherently, which I don't think is that's a crazy point of view, considering the U.S. is the one that is, real quick, the U.S. is the only country that encircles the globe with 800 military bases. There is no other country that even comes close to that level of aggression. So to pretend that American hegemony, if you pretend to be someone who's concerned with human liberation in any way whatsoever, you have to recognize that as the main contradiction facing humanity. And so if you want to say that the anti-imperialist countries are not, you have to contend with that and like then make the case, to me at least, that like Russia is imperialist, even in its goals in Ukraine, or that any other country is imperialist.
I can make a great case that Russia's imperialist. For starters,
hang on.
And I think it's going to be just as laughable as your other stuff, like defending capitalism or freedom of speech. Like,
right. Hang on with that, Matt, because I wanted to push back on this idea that we're the freest in the world. Look,
no, we're not. I'm not saying America's the freest in the world. I'm saying relative to other large countries that have large amounts of military power or just a government of that size.
Freedom is such an elusive word. Like people in China may not have freedom, but they certainly have more healthcare and more access to education, and rent and food is 74% cheaper than the United States.
Is that 74% cheaper just by the currency itself, or 74% cheaper relative to income?
Wages included. Wages included. That these people make enough. We're talking about the power of their money. 74% cheaper. So again, this is Marxist. Xi Jinping himself has come out. Now, I'm not a big pro-China guy. I know that they have trouble. They have these mobile death stations where they come and execute people, blah, 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 blah. But the fact is, their Marxist principles say profits over people is not something that they're interested in. Okay. Whenever that happens, they execute billionaires. They have a lot of troubles. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is not like in the United States. Now, in 9/11, you had the Patriot Act. Now, nobody has any freedom. Nobody has any privacy. You could tap people's phones. You could hold people indefinitely without any charge. That's not the America I grew up in. The criminalization of freedom of speech, indecent comments, obscenities, and anything annoying can be prosecuted. You have corrupt police all over the United States who have military-grade equipment.
Can you go back to the part where you said anything that something that's offensive can be prosecuted? Because
there are cases where people have said something like, for instance, protesters right now who are protesting Palestine, being dragged away, having their heads cracked open. I mean, the footage is all out there. And also, here's what you got to remember is we have more people in prison than any other country in the world. So this freedom thing, I'm just having a hard time wrapping around my head around this argument.
So here's my, once again, counterpoint to this. America absolutely has problems. And America's problems are also far more visible because of the amount of power and influence America has. And when I covered the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, I was actually extremely upset with America, NATO, and the West, specifically because Azerbaijan, through its close relationship with Turkey and Israel, was able to carry out a widespread campaign of ethnic cleansing and war crimes. And it received almost no coverage in the mainstream Western press at all. Like the New York Times did not write a major story on it until the war had ended, and it lasted 6 weeks. So this was the lack of coverage was what led me to become a journalist for some time. And I was very, very upset with this. And I was very, very disappointed with the way the West handled this, where they essentially was willing to allow a NATO member to be involved in war crimes because it was geopolitically convenient, that basically hurting Armenia also hurt Russia's influence. And so this was considered an acceptable trade.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually a great take. I want to like agree.
Yeah.
Like I
That's
100%
great.
agree that like the US and the West like love to do that, to love to throw people under the bus for their economic interests. And I think that's exactly what is happening here. And I think unfortunately time will prove that.
That's what we're talking about. So, Matt, go ahead.
There's a second half to that, but
okay, go ahead. I was going to say, go ahead with Russian imperialism if you wanted to make a case for Russian imperialism.
At least my issue with that is that one of the things that I learned from following the conflict in Ukraine, and the reason I ended up volunteering to come and serve here, was that I tried initially to be neutral, right? I didn't go into covering the conflict with an agenda. And after spending about a month of my life, spending 12 to 14 hours a day, collecting everything I could from Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels, especially seeing the stuff that came out of Bucha and Irpin, that was my point where I felt uncomfortable being a passive observer. And I think the key to pointing towards Russian imperialism is just what Russians themselves say. A great source for how Russians feel is Vladimir Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, where very little of his interview with Tucker Carlson did he talk about Western imperialism, a multipolar world, denazifying Ukraine. Most of his argument boiled down to historically Russia has controlled Ukraine and its resources. We have the strength, we believe we have the strength to take it, and so we are entitled to it, and we will do so. Beyond that,
I think good, sorry.
Yeah, beyond that, look at how if Russia had just, we can go into the details of the DPR and the LPR all day long, but the reality is those places both had leadership that was recently retired Russian FSB. It was absolutely something they set up with their military guys out of uniform. But let's say they were going to keep the facade going and they just moved into the DPR and LPR, tried to set up a demilitarized zone, and just stayed there. This war would not be going on right now. But that's not what they did. They have tried to invade as much of Ukraine as they can. And not only have they annexed or claimed to have annexed, it's not been recognized internationally by almost anyone, Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, that, by the way, they never have full control over. I know, I was in Donetsk Oblast like a month ago. But they also claim that they are entitled to Mariupol and Kherson. They've annexed two. They've tried to annex two. Zaporizhia Oblast and Kherson Oblast. They've tried to annex two entirely separate oblasts that had nothing to do with any of the claims about the DPR and LPR. And they couldn't even make the argument that, well, Stalin gave that to Ukraine, like Crimea or when Khrushchev was redrawing border. There's no argument for that. At no point has anyone disputed that Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts were part of Ukraine. It's purely territorial conquest because they want what's there and they're going to take it. And it's that simple. And it's clear, like you can find plenty of examples of Ukrainians being expelled from their homes in Mariupol that the government then sells to Russian citizens. Yeah. There's videos on Telegram of women that are like buying these homes, videoing Russian police removing Ukrainians from their own homes that have now been assigned to Russians. It's like
so what you're doing is you're talking in this emotional way about what they're doing, and it's totally true. We neither me or Mike, we don't disagree. We agree that what's happening and their techniques and their annexation of all these things is bad. You're on the front lines. You have an emotional stake. You have a horse in the race, as it were.
Yeah,
and I understand that. But you got to see it from this other point of view. Us being from America, I have all the respect for a country having the right to self-determination. We're just wondering the role that the Western powers are playing, the tax money that's being used to do it, and the CIA and these sort of shady organizations and their history, which we've already discussed, about interfering in these kind of affairs, making it worse, arming rebels, funding opposition groups, stirring the pot, creating chaos in the hopes that they're going to be able to siphon the resources out of a country or whatever. Famously when the EU was formed, okay, what Germany was doing basically with all the banks, and you can ask the Greek finance minister, I forget his name. What's his name? He just wrote that book. Varoufakis. What happened was the whole plan of the EU was to take banks like Deutsche Bank and all these IMF, World Bank, things that essentially were used as tools to debt trap countries, and that they were going to expand the EU. And that's what happened to Greece. The Greek debt crisis was caused by Germany trying to debt trap Greece and steal all their homes, because most people at that time had owned their own homes. So it's what we're worried about is not the boots on the ground, what's happening. Obviously, war is terrible. We're talking about the economic interests and the West propagandizing to us why we should spend our tax money in supporting a war that's going on over there at all.
Okay, then earlier on you asked me why keep fighting? Why not go for peace? And here's my answer. Ukraine has attempted to negotiate with Russia multiple times. I would argue the first negotiation was the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where Ukraine became the second country in world history to give up its nuclear arsenal. With the first being South Africa, doing it mostly because they didn't want the not apartheid government to have nukes. But Ukraine basically received guarantees from Russia and the United States and several other countries that if you give up your nukes, we will respect the exact borders you have right now. So that was the first agreement that Ukraine signed with Russia. Beyond that, there is the second agreement, which is the OSCE Minsk Agreement. And I know people like to talk about Ukrainian militias violating that, but if you want a really good source on this, there is a Westerner that was actually serving in the Ukrainian Marines from starting in 2018. And he has tons of posts on his Instagram. I don't know, you might have to dig back for them. But one thing he would do is record ceasefire violations and then complain on his IG story about the fact that he was not allowed to shoot back. And it happened every day.
These are supposedly violations by Russia of the Minsk Accords or whatever?
By Russia or / the DPR, LPR militias, but they're really the same thing. And if you want to go a little bit... So
that's the violations is supposed Instagram post, whereas for the Ukraine, it's building up of arms that they were getting from the West for the years before. Okay, I wanted to go back really quick. When it comes back to imperialism, it was an undeclared war. Yeah, I wanted to go back to just the imperialism thing really quick because I like that always seems to come up when I talk to anyone who's not a Marxist-Leninist or even some Marxist-Leninists, people who claim to be. It's the definition of imperialism seems to be when there's a country, when there's a country that has an army or whatever, which is not what imperialism is. And it's I don't particularly care what people in these areas believe rhetorically, because I don't even believe what Putin says as far as his rhetoric. When he sits down with Tucker Carlson, says a whole bunch of shit about the history of Russia and all, I don't give a fuck. I believe that as much as I believe Joe Biden when he says that we're protecting Israel's sovereignty and that they're acting in self-defense, or that we're going to be seen as liberators anywhere in the world. I don't believe any of that shit. I think it's totally about economic interest. And so when Russia invades or does their special military operation, isn't it that they want to keep access to their port in the Red Sea and Sevastopol? It's they have that one water port and they need to have access to that. It's it seems like it's going to be tactically advantageous and economically advantageous. And again, to make the case that Russia is imperialist because of the things that the people believe, that's not what imperialism is. There's only one empire, and that is the U.S. And so even if Russia is acting in a...
So you're saying that Russia invading in another country and actively engaging in settler colonialism is not imperialism because Russia isn't America? That seems kind of like an absurd
It's not
argument.
Settler colonialism. That's not even the definition of it.
What happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff when we went in there and we got nervous because they were having when a country from far away, brings weapons and points them very close to the border of another country, that is a security threat. And I understand that no matter who the country is, Taiwan and China, like the fact that the United States supports and gives weapons and money to Taiwan is a security threat. How can it be considered anything else?
I mean, here's my issue, right? The overwhelming majority of Russia's population is in Moscow and St. Petersburg areas. If you look at their population clusters, pretty much everything important is in Western Russia, fairly close to the borders with places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and not to put too fine a point on it, but without having a single base or any assets in Ukraine, the United States and NATO would be able to fairly easily conduct strikes against targets in Russia where all the important stuff is without needing anything based out of Ukraine. And as I mentioned before, Ukraine tried to join NATO and were told no. And if you look at the countries that were formerly Warsaw Pact countries or Soviet states that did join NATO, the reason they joined NATO is they all suffered tremendously under the Soviet Union and never wanted to go back to that again. Every single one of those Warsaw Pact countries, like Poland, for example, all suffered horrifically under Russian occupation in modern history. They have a very simple reason to join NATO that has nothing to do with economic coercion or anything else. It's we don't want to ever be invaded by Russia again. It's that simple. Everyone around Russia,
the arguments that I hear in favor.
Other countries feel the same about the United States. They say we got invaded by the United States a long time ago. We're not into it anymore.
That's great. Let me know when every country that shares a border with the United States decides that they want to all be under someone else's nuclear umbrella so they can't be invaded. To the best of my knowledge, there's 2 countries that share land borders with the U.S., and both of them are in pretty good terms with the United States, last I checked.
That's what I mean. Like, every argument in favor of Ukraine comes down to U.S. imperialism apologism. And that's literally what you're doing. You're just you're like backing down to the U.S. has the biggest, strongest military. We're protecting everybody. So
and they're free and they're capitalists. So that makes them the
gross,
good guys.
To be honest, like it's actually disgusting the way the Westerners do this shit.
Relax.
Yeah, sorry, I can't stand the fucking whiteness, and I'm white myself. Like
it is. It's a little hypocritical, but we don't have to descend into
because especially from somebody who like is mad about a conflict that you know the U.S. was
a portion of my wife's family died during the Holodomor and the Holocaust.
I have black friends, bro. Like, go fuck yourself with that shit, dude.
Did you not hear the first part?
That is not a defense, dude. That is not a defense. Like your personal friends or your acquaintances or even your family members, like that is not a defense of like any of your arguments that you're making.
My family is from Ukraine. They were Ukrainian Jewish and fled here after all of the horrible stuff the Russian Empire was doing.
That's terrible. That's undoubtedly terrible. But this also makes it so you have a horse in the race and you're biased towards other people's ideology. Yeah. You're letting emotional aspects, reactionary politics, get in the way of actual a good geopolitical analysis.
And also just the way you fall back on, again, like defending the U.S. military-industrial complex and acting like it's just going to win in the end. Therefore, like everybody else who's like not an apologist for it can dissolve. It's like,
it's that, look, if Russia had the same ability to project force the United States did, things would be a lot worse.
That's a big if, man. That's like a huge if that is like not backed up by anything. Like anything in recent history.
No, it's not, because you can look at the conduct of Russian soldiers here in Ukraine.
Again, you have to break down like to the conduct of the soldiers themselves. Not like I'm talking about like geopolitical policy here, but like
on a systemic level, it's reflected. Look,
we're getting to an hour. I had an idea of a way to like try to wrap this up. Like I would like to hear Matt's predictions for how this is going to go, because my short prediction is that the Ukraine conflict is going to go on for another 2, 4, 8 years, depending on like political squabbles here in the US, like maybe who's president or who's controlling like Congress or the military or whatever. I don't know the ins and outs enough of it, to know. I just feel like it's going to go the same way as like Afghanistan or any of the other proxy wars that the US has waged with like convenient client states. And it's going to go on longer than the U.S. wants it to. And then when it becomes politically inconvenient and unprofitable, the U.S. will let it go. But I don't think the Ukraine is getting the territory that they've lost back.
That's to you, Matt. What do you think how this thing's going to wrap up? How's the Ukraine war going to end?
I think that depends on several factors. First of all, I think it depends on how well the F-16s are actually able to do their job. If those fighter jets can effectively clear the airspace, then the tide of the world will substantially change. And the reason for that is right now we are engaging in trench warfare. Trench warfare does not work when one side or the other can start conducting ground attack missions at will. It just doesn't. So that is one potential element. The other potential element is the degradation of Russia's own military equipment. They've gone from launching most of their assaults using armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks, to increasingly using things like golf carts and electric scooters, and satellite imagery of their stocks of tanks and IFVs shows that they have become heavily depleted. As they run out of those, their ability to continue conducting assaults is being limited. And they've had some recent success by employing large numbers of glide bombs, but those aren't accurate, and they've been also having much higher aircraft rate losses. There was actually an incident on my last deployment where they attempted a combined arms assault with armor and dismounts, and it almost all got completely wiped out, starting with them accidentally dropping a glide bomb on it. So, and it depends on how depleted they are and essentially if they can keep this up. It is a war of attrition, but it depends on...
If the USA and the Western powers pulled out financially, what do you think would happen?
Well, I think saying the USA and the Western powers is...
Let's say just USA.
If the US pulled out, I think things would become increasingly grim. I don't necessarily think that would be the end of the line, though, because the United States functionally only has a geopolitical dog in this fight. They have interests and allies and stuff like that, but on a physical level, American security is not directly impacted by Ukraine completely losing the war.
Okay.
For everyone else in Europe, they really don't want that to happen because they all wonder if they're next. And on top of that, if America pulls out of Ukraine, they'll also wonder how reliable is America as a partner going forward in terms of what happens if Russia, say, decides to move on Poland or the Baltic states. So I'm of the opinion that Europe is in this for the long haul. They are already huge numbers of, they're ramping up ammunition production, tank production. I know they're building new plants in Denmark. France has really been scaling up. And I don't see, France is actually sending instructors into Ukraine now. So already there are going to be French troops physically on the ground here. Yeah. I'm of the opinion that Europe west of Ukraine, power just went. I have my Wi-Fi modem hooked up to an uninterruptible power supply, but there's going to be no camera for me from here on out because no lights. But
and I have to salute you for coming to us live from a war zone. It's pretty ballsy.
I'm not that close to the front, but either way, my point is that Europe is in for the long haul, and if it looks like Ukraine is truly going to lose, I suspect that European countries independent of NATO will become directly involved. And the reality is, I do not think that the Russian military is capable of handling any more than what Ukraine is giving them right now. They are not training their guys well. They're using older Soviet equipment. And at this stage, the only thing that I think would be able to get them a decisive victory is either some sort of dramatic operation where they manage to completely decapitate the Ukrainian government overnight, or they begin receiving substantial overt aid from China in the form of China just sending them modern main battle tanks, more guided munitions, and all of that sort of thing. But as things currently stand, I don't see China being willing to do it that openly because they really try to act more neutral than they really are.
Yeah, that's true.
Chris, did you have a prediction too?
My prediction? I don't really have a prediction. I was talking to my wife about this. I don't think that there's going to be a clear way out. It could go any which way. I'm counting on humanity to kill itself before all that. So I'm just rooting for the demise of everything. But really, it could be they both come to the bargaining table and they carve up small parts of the Ukraine and give it to Russia as a way to end this war. The politics in the United States could very well be just like Afghanistan and all these other places that we're losing our influence in, that we pull away from funding these kind of wars because we can't afford it anymore, because we are losing on the world stage in the manufacturing. China just surpassed in 2017 surpassed America as the biggest GDP in PPP terms. I
want to actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think there's worth digging into that comparison with Afghanistan, because it's important to understand why Afghanistan was ultimately a failure, and also why Ukraine is not. So Afghanistan never has had a defined national identity. There was no Afghani identity. Afghanistan was a nation consisting of a large number of separate tribes, many of whom had feuds with each other over various different things. And none of the people involved in trying to create a government there had any real investment in Afghanistan, the country. So the entire thing fell apart the moment the US stopped propping it up, because Afghanistan was more or less a territory drawn up by the British at some point, and it's never had this sort of identity. It's been a country of tribes and warlords. Ukraine has a very clearly defined national identity. It is a real country. And I don't mean that in terms of as a term of disrespect to Afghanistan, but if you go to Afghanistan and you ask the average person, what are you like in terms of nationality? Most of them are not going to tell you, I'm an Afghan. They're going to tell you their tribe. They're going to say, I'm Pashtun. And
to be fair, in Ukraine, you have Crimean Tatars, you have Kyrgyzs, Kimchaks.
Yes, you do have various small ethnic groups. However, if you also look at the history of those groups, most of them are not pro-Russia. In fact, most of them suffered horribly under the Soviet Union. And so
here we go again. God.
All right. So Chris, I guess I'm content to wrap it up.
Let's
Matt,
wrap it up.
just to make it clear, the discrepancy between our two predictions is that you don't think it's going to be a prolonged conflict, and you think Ukraine's going to get that territory back.
Very prolonged. I think this is going to last for another 2-3 years at minimum.
Okay.
I've been here since March 2022.
Do you think Ukraine's going to get that territory back from Russia that they've lost?
I think they're going to get some things back. I don't necessarily think they're going to get everything back, but I think the issue here fundamentally is that Russia has a history of not abiding by treaties they sign. And so
here we go.
Ukraine has to end the war on Ukraine's terms. If Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire now, realistically, the terms Russia would want would be the same terms that they went into the war demanding, which is Ukraine is demilitarized and remains neutral. And those terms are unacceptable for Ukraine because there's no guarantee that Russia will not simply rebuild its military for 5 years and then invade Ukraine again.
Well, I was content to leave it on all the previous Russophobia and Soviet demonizing, but then when the added bonus of Afghanistan is not a real country because it's a bunch of tribes and warlords, kind of racism.
What I mean is Afghanistan is not a country that has a coherent national identity. And that was
easy. Everything I need to say about Ukraine apologists, man. This is perfect for me and my podcast. I can't wait to publish it.
This might this might not be the last one. I'd actually have an immense amount of respect for both of you for coming on the program. And I'd actually like to do it again next week if you guys have the marbles.
No, take all my spiciness for what it is. It's internet clickbait stuff. I'm doing what I'm doing.
He's my bulldog. He's here to just rile it up. Matt, I have incredible amount of respect for you.
No, it's fine. Hey, look, I actually dropped out of Reed College, so none of
No, you're a very bright guy. I'm not lying.
He's a bright fucking guy.
Yeah.
You're brilliant. You're a brilliant mind, man. So if you're available, let's do it next week, and because we're not even coming close to having a satisfying debate, and I got to be honest.
Honestly, my memory is a little bit fuzzy on some of the details of this stuff. I need to do more reading on my end.
Good.
I thought you were like from sources the way you were recalling that stuff. I thought your memory was great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I try, but there are still gaps.
Well, look, I'll let you get back. I know it's late there. Have a great night. Stay safe. And we just have the most respect for you. And goddamn, you really came with a lot of facts I didn't even know. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So hit me up on Instagram and I'll hit you when this goes live. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Later, Matt.
Later.